Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're going to be talking about animal agriculture, environment, health, and ethics. And with me I have a couple of people who are very interested in the whole issue of animal agriculture and taking meat out of the diet. I have David Feldman and I have Greg Farough. Now, both of you are with the Industrial Workers of the World and the Autonomy Alliance. Did I have that correct?
Yeah, speaking in a personal capacity.
Okay, great. And so what is the Autonomy Alliance?
Autonomy Alliance is a left-wing organization that operates in the greater St. Louis area, mostly to do educational outreach about economic issues, questions of gender, sexism, racism, things like that. So
okay.
we mostly distribute literature at events around town.
And what about the Industrial Workers of the World? What does that do?
The Industrial Workers of the World is a pretty historic union that's been active pretty solidly since the 1900s. Does a lot of organization of service workers and different things, and it's a pretty historic union. I mean, if you look at history, you'll always see the Industrial Workers of the World.
Over 100 years old.
Yeah. You'll see the Wobblies come up. Yeah, okay. Exactly.
Well, listen, we are going to get into the issue of veganism and what taking meat out of the diet and using a plant-based diet means. But first of all, let's take a break, and then we'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode I have a couple of people with me who are interested in talking about having a plant-based diet. I have Greg Farough and David Feldman, and we're going to be talking about animal agriculture. Now, one of the first things we're going to be covering veganism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And one of the things you told me to ask you was how's veganism different from lacto-ovo vegetarianism? Now, what in the world is lacto-ovo vegetarianism? That sounds like somebody would want to avoid that, just so they wouldn't have to describe what they are.
Well, most vegetarians actually fall into the lacto-ovo category, and those are vegetarians that will still consume eggs and still consume dairy products,
okay,
and honey and things like that, and might even wear leather and other byproducts of the animal exploitation industry. Veganism is kind of the logical extension of that, taking into account the health benefits, the environmental benefits, and the ethical component of vegetarianism, and kind of taking it to the next step. So a vegan, I guess the distinguishing aspect between a vegan and a vegetarian would be a vegan would exclude all those animal products from the diet, and also exclude the use of animal products and the use of like cosmetics and the use of like clothing.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on animals that goes into the production of cosmetics, isn't there?
Yeah, and also like the medical industry, like most drugs are tested on animals before they go to market. So yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Greg, could you tell me what are some of the misconceptions about veganism that you've heard people say?
Sure. In different industrial commercials and things, you often hear veganism described as this very difficult thing that's just this monumentous task that that the average person couldn't really accomplish. And that's really not true. I mean, veganism is very easy to practice. It's inexpensive generally. And when you're practicing vegan, you aren't nearly as unhealthy as people would have you believe. You know, you don't really lack protein. You don't have a severe vitamin deficiency or anything like that. When you implement a vegan diet, you're really doing something that's beneficial both for yourself and for the world in general.
Isn't it kind of hard if you're going out to eat with friends to practice a vegan diet? I've noticed at places that I go, they expect that the only thing that people eat if they're vegans is salad. And it's like they have salad for breakfast, salad for lunch, and salad for dinner, and then salad for dessert.
Yeah, I think there's no shortage of negative stereotypes associated, not just with vegetarianism, but also with veganism. Yeah, like you said, people assume that you live on grass and figs and apples and things like that. And it actually, like speaking personally, like my palate has expanded like enormously since I went vegan several years ago.
But isn't it hard when you go out to eat? I mean, unless you have, there's a very few vegan restaurants in St. Louis.
There are very few specifically vegan restaurants, but I think when you look at the diets of most foods of the world, like most ethnic foods, like they are plant-based diets. I mean, if you look at Mediterranean food or Asian food, like those are diets that are primarily based on plant foods.
Well, is that the way that most people have spent most of their life for the last few thousand years? It seems to me that meat might be something that has been a luxury for a long period of time, or something that people would eat occasionally, not 3 times a day like Americans are currently encouraged to eat meat.
Yeah, I would say I'm probably not in a position to answer that with any authority, but I will say that like the cost of producing meat is much higher than people assume, because the meat industry is so heavily subsidized, especially in the United States, that people don't make that association. Like, you know, there's numbers that are like, I think it takes 10 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat.
Right.
So I mean, people just don't realize like just the tremendous amount of resources in land and fresh water that go into producing, you know, beef, for instance. And so the cost of meat should actually be much higher than it is.
Yeah, that's a real concern that I hear a lot of people expressing, is that having a vegetarian or vegan diet would be very expensive because it would cost so much more. You know, it's just cheaper to buy ground meat and make hamburgers than it is to buy fresh produce.
There are products on the market that I think are more geared toward like people who want convenience. I'm speaking about vegetarians. Things like frozen soy burgers and things like that I think cost more than they should. But I think that's testament to the nature of a market economy, and not testament to the cost of producing those products. I think if people cook with whole foods, they'll find that being vegetarian, and especially being vegan, is actually a lot cheaper than people think. And a lot of those misconceptions about veganism being this bourgeois, you know, lifestyle fad are completely inaccurate. So yeah, I think if people just go to the library, just get a Whole Foods cookbook, you'll realize that cooking with whole grains and lentils and beans and things like that, it's actually very, very cheap if you put the time into preparing your own food.
Okay, well, Greg, what are some of the ethical issues that people bring up with veganism or with vegetarianism?
Sure. As David was mentioning earlier, vegetarianism and veganism are both kind of generally about ending animal exploitation, like doing whatever we can to ensure that animals are treated in a humane manner. And what veganism does, as David mentioned, kind of takes that to its logical conclusion and is about living a life completely free of any kind of animal products, whether that's meat or clothing, etc. And a vegan diet in general just eliminates those functions of animal byproducts, but it also takes into consideration that animals kind of aren't on a different level from human beings. You know, generally we conceive of human beings as being at the top of the food chain and having this kind of definite domination over the rest of the animal world. And a vegan perspective kind of eliminates that and says, well, maybe this isn't true, and maybe we should re-examine our speciesist assumptions of how we live our life. You know, on a biological level, just generally, human beings aren't all that different from animals. And a vegan kind of perspective takes that into account and says, well, how can we live our lives after that model?
Well, don't animals eat other animals?
That's true, but I think we've come to the point where we can kind of eliminate any kind of undue suffering. I mean, if you look at factory farms, et cetera, we treat them intolerably. I mean, when an animal kills another animal, that's one thing, but when we mass kill animals on this very kind of inhumane global scale, that's something different entirely.
Okay. Well, what about what we're talking before about lacto-ovo vegetarianism, where people are vegetarian and they eat eggs and they eat cheese? Are they moving towards the sort of direction that you hope that people would be going?
I would say absolutely. I think taking an incremental approach is preferable to trying to do it all in one fell swoop and then coming to the conclusion that you just can't do it and then dropping out and going back to supporting the animal exploitation industry. Speaking personally, and a lot of people I know, like, came to veganism through incremental steps. They became vegetarian, and then they just started excluding all animal products from their diet. And I think it's better for people to take a long-term approach and to do it in a way they're comfortable with, as opposed to trying to do it all at once.
Okay. Well, one of the issues that I think is very important is whether you're looking at the individual commitment by a few people or whether you're looking at social policy change. And I had a discussion with Howard Lyman years ago. Are y'all familiar with Howard Lyman?
He's a former cattle rancher, I think.
He's a former cattle rancher, and he was on Oprah Winfrey's show. And when he described what CAFOs were like and confined animal feeding operations and how beef is actually raised, and his own health problems with eating beef, then Oprah said, "Well, I'll never eat another burger." And so then she was threatened with lawsuits and all sorts of other harassment. But when he was staying at my house one time several years ago, I was discussing the need, to have having everybody eat less meat versus a small number of people eating, a small number of people completely giving up meat. And he said, well, it's really important to have people totally give up meat, because if you give up meat, if you eat a little bit of meat, then you still have the craving for meat, and so you need to give it up totally. And I was saying, well, yeah, but that's not going to happen. You're not going to get 300 million people in the United States to totally give up meat. So I wonder if you could, both of y'all could weigh in on that.
I think it's kind of a false dichotomy, to be honest. I think if you would ask an ordinary person 100 years ago whether there would be as many vegetarians and vegans as there are today at the beginning of the 21st century, they would think that it would be completely insane. But I mean, here we are. I mean, I've read statistics that as many as 1 to 2% of the U.S. population is vegan, or if you take into consideration the number of just lacto-ovo vegetarians, it's even higher. It's like 5 or 6%, I think. So I think we have to be realistic, but also try to push forward. I mean, taking into account just the fact that it's not going to be possible to produce meat and dairy products on the scale that we're currently producing them 50 or 60 years down the road. I mean, if we take into consideration population growth, it's not going to be feasible. So I think we just have to kind of buck up and just face the facts and try to move toward a large number of people giving up animal products, and that I think that can be done on a grassroots level for the most part.
Okay, what about structural changes?
I completely agree with David when he says that it's kind of harmful to pit veganism against vegetarianism in general. I think we're all on the same page here, and any kind of step that you can do will definitely be beneficial. And while I don't think it's feasible at the moment to say that veganism is going to really enact like major structural changes within the next few years, I mean, as long as we have this core group of people who are committed to animal rights and animal activism, I think those misconceptions that people have and these ideas that people have that animals are okay to use and exploit however they wish will kind of vanish in time. I mean, I think we're just at a period where the consciousness isn't totally there, but I think we're definitely getting there as time goes on.
Okay, listen, we're going to take a break and see an announcement, and then we will come back in just a couple of minutes, and we have we've covered a lot of ground, but we have some other issues that are really important to go over. Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're talking about animal agriculture, environment, health, and ethics. And with me I have a couple of guests who have put a lot of their time and energy into thinking about developing a plant-based diet and removing animal products from diet. I have David Feldmann and Greg Farough, both are with Autonomy Alliance and Industrial Workers of the World. Now, one of the things that has happened in the U.S. is that there's been an enormous change in agriculture over the last half a century. What sort of changes have happened that have pushed in the direction of using animals?
Basically, the industry has become much more efficient. The cost of that efficiency has been conditions for animals that are just completely horrendous and completely barbaric. I mean, a lot of us have seen images out of factory farms of chickens and battery cages just stacked one on top of the other. Mm-hmm. We've seen images of veal calves kept in extremely small confined areas. I mean, the list just goes on and on. I mean, animals are treated like products basically because it's more efficient for the industry to exploit them in that way. So, the myth of the small family farm is just that. It's a myth. It's not how most animal products are produced for consumers.
Right, I was just about to mention that. This idea that all meat comes from, this one farmer working and plowing the land by himself is just totally ridiculous. I mean, 99% of our meat comes from these horribly horrendous factory farming conditions. I mean, calves are still, kept in these intolerable kind of ways. Sows are given a cage about as big as their entire body. I mean, just if you look at these pictures, they're just horrifying, and that's why most people don't want to see them, because they know that seeing this picture face to face gives you this kind of moral obligation to do something about it, and that's something that people don't want to really face to themselves.
Okay, and so basically what animal agriculture has done at the beginning of the 21st century is to consolidate a type of animal suffering and an intensity of animal suffering that hasn't been known before. What about if you're buying free-range chickens? Do they get to? Does it if you have a label free range, does that mean that that's pretty good idea to purchase that?
Actually, I would advise against, if you're going to buy eggs, I mean, I encourage people to not buy eggs, but if you're going to, I would encourage people to not pay the extra money for those products, because there's not actually a legal definition for what free range means in the United States. It's very unlike Europe, where they have strictly defined parameters for what that actually means. In the U.S., it's a completely meaningless term. So I mean, you could cram, 1,000 chickens into a space of, the size of this room. I mean, they could still label it free range. There are no legal ramifications for labeling something as free range in the United States. So.
Exactly, and the myth perpetuated about free-range chickens in general is that they live this really kind of happy existence, but that's absolutely not true. I mean, running down the list, you still see that the chickens are still debeaked. The male chicks are killed as soon as they're born. I mean, when you look at it, it's really not as good as they're describing. I mean, it's actually pretty bad.
I think we also need to take into account, vegans tend to look at this issue from an ethical standpoint as well as an environmental and as well as an environmental standpoint. So I mean, like from an ethical standpoint, there's really not any distinction to be made between animals that are slaughtered quote unquote humanely and animals that are just kept alive in a factory farm until it's time to kill them. I mean, they're living sentient creatures. I mean, there's not a moral or ethical distinction to be made.
Now we got to back up on that.
Sure.
Are you telling me that if you had an extension to humans, that there would be no difference between confining somebody in prison and torturing somebody if they're in prison?
I mean, if the ultimate outcome is death, then I think we're talking about a matter of degree that's negligible. I mean, our focus should be like, are these animals being killed? And if so, like, is that justifiable?
And you're saying that it's irrelevant if the animal is tortured for years prior to being killed?
It's not irrelevant. I think, I mean, from the standpoint of like someone who tries to be an ethical consumer, it doesn't really cross my mind. I mean, I think as like the vegan community is trying to address these like in a more broad way, basically, and trying to challenge these that we make as a society that says, animals are just biological machines, and we can torture and maim them and ultimately kill them for our own purposes, and there's nothing wrong with that. So,
okay. In 2010, the United Nations environmental program came out that had a lot to do with the issues that you're concerned about with veganism. Could you go over some of the?
Yeah, it was in summer of 2010. I think it was called the UN Environmental Program. The report mostly touched on natural resources, minerals, and things like that. The very end of it touched on animal agriculture, and basically it came to the conclusion that by 2050 or 2060, taking into consideration population growth across the planet, we're going to have to increase the output of animal agriculture by 70, maybe even 75%. And there's just not going to be enough land to do that, especially if we're trying to produce it in a way that's quote unquote humane. I mean, I think the idea of happy meat and free range, slaughter, there's no way to accommodate that given the amount of arable land and given the amount of space we have on this planet. So
by those statistics alone, I mean, people are going to be forced into a vegetable diet or they're just going to starve. I mean, at some point we're going to have to reconsider our assumptions of how we want to eat. I mean, the average American eats meat at a radically higher rate than most of the world. And when
Yeah, we're basically telling on television you need to eat meat 3 times a day.
Right,
because it's sausage and things like the bacon are advertised for breakfast, and then it's just assumed you have to have a hamburger for lunch and a steak for dinner.
Right, and it's going to require just this radical shift in consciousness to say, well, maybe I don't actually need meat 3 times a day, maybe I don't need it once a day, because it's just going to be so expensive. I need to reconsider having a plant-based diet.
Could you go into a little bit about why there would be those limitations on the growing meat? If it increases 7-fold, because obviously if you drive out into rural areas, you don't see one confined animal feeding operation after another. They obviously take up only a very small space. So why couldn't it? What are the limitations there besides the actual area that the animal is grown in?
Well, I just don't think we have the resources to sustain that kind of thing.
Okay, in other words, it would be the other sorts of inputs that would go into it, and not just the land itself for the animal.
There's also waste that comes from these factory farms
Right.
that will get into water streams and pollute large amounts of fresh water. And as we know, fresh water is a invaluable resource, and there's only so much of it on the planet. And if we're pumping animal waste, to put it nicely, into onto lands and into streams, that's going to have an effect on the amount of fresh water we have access to.
And looking at it environmentally for a second, I mean, the amount of methane gas being exposed to the air already is at a totally unsustainable number. And if we have to increase meat production by sevenfold, that's just going to be astronomical.
And right, doesn't meat production actually account for more greenhouse gases than the sum of automobiles, planes, and trucks?
That's exactly right.
One of the conclusions of that UN report was just that it's, if not more, definitely a comparable amount of methane gas is being released.
Right, and so it does surprise me a lot that people who oppose coal mines and people who oppose exploitation of fracking with natural gas because of the pollution involved with those industries very frequently won't have anything at all critical to say about the increase in meat production, while the actual impact on the actual impact on greenhouse gases is perhaps as large as opening hundreds of new coal mines.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who get involved in environmentalism, a lot of these issues just seem so far away that it's hard to figure out a way that you can actually have a positive effect on that, or any kind of effect at all. And whereas going vegan, or at the very least going vegetarian, that has a drastic effect on your carbon footprint, to use a term that's kind of popular now. I mean, it's also one of the easiest things you can do. It's a choice you make at least 3 times a day, and it's something that, it's a decision you make that can easily be changed from consuming animal goods to
Now, how many people did you say were vegans and vegetarians in the United States?
The statistics I've read over the past 5 or some odd years, it hovers between 0.5 and 2% are vegan. I'm sure there's a margin of error. I don't know what that is. And if you take into account the number of people who are lacto-ovo vegetarian, I think it's closer to 5 or 6% of the U.S. population.
No, why do most people make those decisions to go in the direction of vegetarian or vegan?
I think a lot of people, especially in the past 20 or 30 years, have just become more aware of what it means to produce meat. For instance, maybe they've seen footage of the inside of a slaughterhouse, or they have a companion animal that they really love and care for, and they make that mental association that I wouldn't kill my cat for food. Why should I buy a product that's only there because someone else has murdered a sentient creature?
Okay, so. Well, let me ask you this: if you're involved in progressive groups, and do you find that there's more or less concern about vegetarianism and veganism currently than there was, say, 10 or 15 years ago?
Very often you'll see different groups saying, well, let's focus on our own thing for now and get to veganism later. But I really think that you need to focus on veganism now. I mean, it's a definite, it's of huge importance. I mean, as David was mentioning, it lowers your carbon footprint significantly. But just kind of speaking of our own organizations, Autonomy Alliance and the IWW, I mean, both of those are very supportive of a vegan lifestyle. Just in Autonomy Alliance alone, we have several, it's a small group, but we have several vegetarian members. And in the IWW, there's a significant portion that are very socially conscious when it comes to animal exploitation and already follow a vegan lifestyle.
And I know when I was reading about the Spanish Revolution and looking at interviews people did with Spanish anarchists, it impressed me that the people who were really dedicated anarchists in the Spanish Revolution would not smoke because they considered that a capitalist vice. They wouldn't drink alcohol, and they would not eat meat. And that's from the 1930s, and here we are 70 years later. And to me, it seems like there's a smaller number of people in the United States who are really committed to understanding the importance of taking meat out of the diet. Okay, David Feldmann and Gary Farough, I want to thank you very much for coming to this episode of Green Time. And I want to remind everybody that Green Time is going to be on at the same time next week. And so please, if at all possible, tune into Green Time, and you get to see more about issues relating to vegetarian and relating to the lifestyles that we make. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Okay. We're about 6 seconds short of that, but that's Corey's brilliant.